Day 38. I woke to birds arguing in the trees, not the nervous chirping of creatures about to flee. Actual arguments, the kind that go on when nothing larger is hunting nearby. I lay still and listened longer than I should have, letting the sound sink in. The hills were still occupied of enemy. I could see that, but the posture up there had changed, fewer silhouettes, less movement, longer gaps between anything worth reporting. By mid-morning, the airstrip operated almost normally, not recklessly, but continuously. In the afternoon, I authorized slightly deeper patrols, still cautious, still experienced men only. They returned reporting enemy units were digging defensively, not offensively, trenches angled away from us, bunkers oriented to hold ground, not to attack downhill. That was the clearest sign yet. The siege wasn't being reinforced, it was being managed. As evening approached, the valley looked wider again, not because the hills moved, but because the feeling of being squeezed had eased. I stood at an observation point at dusk and realized something that caught me off guard. I was no longer counting hours to the next impact. Day 38 ended without a single meaningful shot fired, and in war, days like that are louder than any barrage. They tell you where the enemy's mind is, and tonight, the enemy's mind was no longer fixed on the destruction of Long Tieng, but on what it would cost to stay. Day 39. I woke with a plan already formed in my head, and that was new. For weeks, mornings had been about reacting, counting what remained, bracing for what might come. Today, for the first time since February, I woke thinking about movement. Not reckless movement, but measured movement. The enemy had been quiet long enough to tell us something important. The pressure had eased not by accident, but by decision. Their lines had pulled back just enough to create gaps, small ones, and gaps are opportunities. I gathered my squad leaders mid-morning. We spoke low, maps spread on the ground, fingers tracing terrain we knew too well. There was a shallow fold north of our line, a piece of minor high ground we had abandoned weeks earlier when holding it meant dying for it. Now it was quiet, too quiet to ignore. The plan was simple, a limited counter-movement. No flags, no speeches, just take the ground if it was empty, and leave it if it wasn't. No heroics. We moved late morning, when the sun was high enough to blind optics and the sky still promised attention. 2 squads forward, one in overwatch, one in reserve, slow, low, listening more than looking. The ground felt different under my boots, less watched, less claimed. We reached the fold without contact. That alone made my pulse jump. Signs of recent occupation were there. Old fighting holes, ration tins, trampled brush, but no fresh tracks, no warmth in the earth, no sense of men just beyond sight. The enemy had left it deliberately, not in panic, and we took it just as deliberately. Positions were re-established quietly, fields of fire rechecked. No digging more than necessary. The idea was not to announce ourselves, but to exist there again. By early afternoon, the enemy reacted. Not violently, but noticeably. Movement appeared on distant ridges. A few shots cracked far wide. More annoyance than threat. No mortars, no heavy weapons. They were watching to see if we would overreach, and we didn't. I ordered the squads to hold only until dusk, then rotate back. Ground taken does not need to be held forever to be valuable. Sometimes, just touching it again reminds everyone that the balance has shifted. As we pulled back, unchallenged, I felt something settle that I hadn't felt since before the siege tightened, and that was confidence. That night, I lay awake replaying the movement in my head, not out of fear, but out of analysis. The enemy had not contested, and that told me more than a firefight ever could. Day 39 ended without casualties, without loss, with a small piece of ground no longer belonging solely to the enemy. It was not a victory, but it was a signal that we were no longer only surviving in Long Tieng. We were beginning to shape it again. Day 40. The enemy noticed our movement yesterday, and that was clear before the sun fully rose. Enemy movement appeared early on the ridges we had touched and left, figures stopping, crouching, pointing, no rush, No anger, just assessment, the kind that says we felt that. I took it as confirmation that day 39 had mattered. There was no immediate fire. Instead, the morning unfolded with a strange politeness, like two men acknowledging each other after a hard exchange. The hills were alive again, but not loud and not aggressive. We stayed disciplined with no unnecessary movement. By mid-morning, the enemy made their reply, not with mortars, not with recoilless rifles, but with infantry, a limited push on the western slopes, not a charge, not a full assault, just enough men moving forward to test whether our movement yesterday had been a bluff, whether our return to that ground had been temporary, or a sign of intent. They moved well, and I'll give them that, using folds and shadows, doing what professional soldiers do. We let them come close enough to matter, then we stopped them. Our machine guns spoke briefly. Rifles answered with discipline. No shouting and no chasing. The fire was just enough to say this space is no longer free. The enemy halted, adjusted, and pulled back slightly. No enemy mortars followed, and no larger escalation, and that told me everything. They weren't ready to pay for another push. Not today. In the afternoon, air activity increased. Not strikes, just presence. Aircraft passed low enough to be unmistakable. The enemy stayed put. They had learned that lesson already. I used the quiet hours to rotate men properly for real rest. As dusk approached, I walked the line and realized something subtle but important. The men were no longer asking if the enemy would attack. They were asking where, and that shift matters. It means fear has narrowed into focus. Night fell without enemy probing, just sound of insects reclaiming space. I lay awake thinking about ground, how little of it actually matters, and how much of it becomes sacred once blood touches it. Day 40 ended with Long Tieng quieter than it had been in weeks, but no less dangerous. The siege was not over, but it had changed shape again, and now, for the first time, the enemy was reacting to us, not the other way around. Day 41. The morning carried a different weight, not the suffocating pressure of February, not the stunned quiet after arc light. This was the weight of two forces that had learned each other's limits. I woke before first light, not from fear, but from habit. The men stirred quietly, rolling shoulders, adjusting straps. No one needed to be told what to do anymore. That was new and dangerous in its own way. Confidence must be managed as carefully as ammunition. The hills were active again at dawn, not aggressively, but deliberately. Enemy figures moved laterally, reinforcing positions, setting fields of observation that mirrored ours. They weren't pushing downhill. They were holding ground they now believed was worth holding, and that told me yesterday's exchange had drawn a line. By mid-morning, we confirmed it. Patrols reported enemy positions on the western slopes that had not been there 2 days ago. Dug in, camouflaged, oriented defensively. The siege had transitioned. This was no longer a tightening noose. It was a frozen front. The airstrip operated smoothly through the morning. Supplies came in without harassment. Wounded went out in daylight without being rushed. I watched one aircraft lift off slowly, unchallenged, and felt a strange tightening in my chest. In the afternoon, we probed again, not to advance, but to test reaction. A small patrol edged forward into contested ground, careful not to expose itself. The enemy spotted them, tracked them, but did not fire. That restraint mattered. It meant neither side wanted to reopen the bleeding. By dusk, the valley felt balanced on a blade. Too much movement could tip it. Too much passivity could invite pressure. I adjusted watch schedules, spacing men closer than doctrine would suggest, but farther than desperation would demand. That night, the jungle felt almost respectful, just distant sounds of men existing on opposite slopes of the same fear. I lay awake longer than necessary, thinking about the men who had died for ground we now watched instead of bled on, thinking about how war sometimes pauses not because one side has won, but because both sides have counted the cost too accurately to continue blindly. Day 41 ended without gunfire worth recording, but it ended with something far more important. Stability, Not peace, not safety, but a fragile, hard-earned balance that said Long Tieng had survived its worst moment. Tomorrow would decide whether that balance held or shifted again. Day 42. The morning felt suspended, like a bowl of water held perfectly still, just a pale sun lifting itself over ridgelines that had learned too many lessons in too little time. I stayed low longer than usual, listening to the jungle speaking in its normal voice again. Birds calling, insects humming, wind moving leaves without urgency. When war pauses, nature is always the first to test whether it's safe to return. I saw in the way shoulders loosened a fraction, in the way eyes lingered less on shadows and more on hands of straps. I tightened discipline without raising my voice. Radio stayed quiet unless needed. A commander's job on days like this is not to create motion, but to prevent mistakes. By mid-morning, reports came in from multiple sectors. Skirmishing only, a shot here, a movement there, no attempt to push, no attempt to retake what had been contested. The enemy stayed dug in, but their posture was no longer predatory. They watched, and we watched back. The space between us felt measured, agreed upon without words. The airstrip ran smoothly today. CIA Air America aircraft came and went with almost embarrassing normality. In the afternoon, I let myself sit for the first time in days without scanning constantly, just for a minute, long enough to feel the ache in my back, the stiffness in my hands, the way fatigue had settled into my bones like old age. Then I stood up again, because days like this don't end wars. They tempt men into believing wars have ended. As dusk fell, the sky turned gentle shades, purple, gray, gold, too beautiful for the things that had happened under it. I reminded the platoon, quiet does not mean finished. They nodded. They already knew. Night came clean and clear with stars bright and steady wind. I lay awake longer than usual, not from fear, but from memory. The mind finally had space to replay what it had postponed for weeks. Day 42 ended without blood, without ground changing hands, without the sky needing to intervene. It ended with something rarer than victory, a shared understanding, on both sides of the hills, that the worst had already been paid. Tomorrow would tell us whether that understanding hardened into permanence, or cracked under the weight of unfinished war. Day 43. Routine is a strange thing in war. You don't notice it returning all at once. It creeps back in small, almost embarrassing ways. Boots lined up a little straighter, weapons cleaned a little longer than necessary, men checking each other's gear without being told. Routine feels like home, and home is dangerous to believe in too early. The morning opened clear and cool. No smoke hanging in the valley, no shockwave echoing off the hills, just sunlight touching the ridgelines like it always had, before those ridges learned how to kill. I watched the men move, still low, still cautious, but no longer coiled. They knew where the enemy was. They knew where we were. That knowledge took the edge off fear and replaced it with calculation. By mid-morning, reports from adjacent sectors matched ours. No major engagements. A few shots exchanged between patrols who stumbled too close. I stood near the strip for a moment and realized something subtle. No one flinched when a plane landed. That reaction, or the lack of it, told me more than any intelligence report. In the afternoon, I met with other platoon commanders under cover. We spoke quietly, comparing impressions more than facts. Everyone felt the same thing. The front had hardened. The enemy was no longer maneuvering to close us. He was consolidating what he held and accepting what he did not. That acceptance was not kindness. It was arithmetic. As the sun lowered, I walked my line and stopped at a fighting hole that had been occupied by 3 different men over the past month. The edges were worn smooth by elbows and boots. I realized I could picture every meter of this place in my head without looking. That's how war imprints itself. Night fell without ceremony, with no enemy probing again, just darkness, and the sound of men settling into watch rotations that finally made sense again. I lay awake for a while, listening to the valley breathe. Day 43 ended without drama, and in war, that kind of ending is not empty. It means the battle for Long Tieng had crossed its most dangerous threshold. Not victory, not defeat, but continuity. We were still here, they were still there. And for now, neither side believed it was worth dying tonight to change that. Day 44. The morning carried a question. It wasn't written in smoke or noise. It sat in the way the hills looked slightly more alert than yesterday, in a way distant movement paused when watched. The enemy was testing the balance we'd found. It came late morning, an enemy probing push from the north, small, deliberate, and better coordinated than the skirmishes of the last few days. Enemy infantry advanced in pairs, using the same folds of ground they'd tried weeks earlier, as if checking whether time had erased our memory. We let them come close enough to matter, close enough that they committed to the idea that today might be different. Then we stopped them, not with volume, but with precision. Machine guns opened briefly, rifles followed with measured fire, the kind of response that says we know this ground better than you think. The enemy halted, adjusted, and tried to edge sideways, searching for a softer angle. We didn't give them any. Within minutes, they pulled back under their own cover fire, controlled, unpanicked. They hadn't come to break us, they had come to confirm something, and they confirmed it. The rest of the day settled back into watchfulness. The sky stayed present but quiet, a reminder rather than a threat. In the afternoon, I walked the line and felt the change in the men, the kind that comes from doing exactly what was required and nothing more. As dusk fell, the hills went still again. The enemy had taken the measure of the day and accepted it. I lay awake that night thinking about how wars don't always end with retreats or victories. Sometimes they end with a realization shared by both sides at the same time. Day 44 ended with Long Tieng unchanged on the map, but firmer in the mind. The enemy had reached out one more time and found that the door, for now, was closed. Day 45. I woke to movement that didn't feel hostile, distant figures on the ridges shifting laterally instead of forward. Packs slung, tools carried openly, men walking instead of creeping. It took me a few long minutes of watching to understand what my eyes were telling me. The enemy was repositioning, not to attack, but to leave the line of contact. I didn't announce it. Announcing things too early invites disappointment. Instead, I watched and had my squad leaders watch with me. We compared notes without using the word we were all thinking. Enemy withdrawal. Not full, not rushed, but real. By mid-morning, confirmation came in pieces. Patrols reported abandoned bunkers farther back than yesterday. Heavy weapons gone from positions that had once dominated our approach. Trails that had been beaten flat for weeks, already softening at the edges. The enemy was pulling strength away from Long Tieng, not because they had lost the war, but because this fight was no longer worth the cost. That realization sat heavy and strange in my chest. I ordered restraint, for no pursuit, and no opportunistic fire. An enemy withdrawing under discipline is still dangerous, and men who smell victory too early end up dead for nothing. The airstrip ran smoothly all morning. CIA Air America aircraft came and went without harassment. In the afternoon, we advanced a little, not aggressively, just enough to confirm what our eyes already believed. We stepped into ground that had been untouchable weeks earlier and found it empty, fighting holes cold, and no trash left behind. That told me everything I needed to know about the enemy commander. He had measured the valley, tried to break it, failed at acceptable cost, and now he was choosing to spend his strength elsewhere. As dusk approached, I walked to a rise overlooking the valley and stood there longer than necessary. Long Tieng lay below me, battered but breathing. Smoke no longer clung to it, with movement being purposeful again and not panicked. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since February, not because the war was over, but because this battle was. Day 45 ended without a shot fired in anger. It ended with something far rarer than victory. The enemy had decided Long Tieng would not fall today, and we had decided not to chase them into the hills to prove something already proven. The siege, the thing that had aged us all, had begun to loosen its grip.